Thanks.
Oh. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Just going to give it a few seconds for people to hop on. Great, I'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance discussion. I'm Jacqueline Lagoy, and I'd like to thank you for joining on Zoom today and for your partnership in the Research America Alliance. I hope everyone is looking forward to the discussion as much as I am. But first, a little administrative housekeeping. If your organization is not a member, I hope you'll shoot an email to Joel, our director of membership, whose email is now in the chat to discuss the Alliance. So today, we are joined by Dr. Daniel Pham, Dr. Cara Altimus, and Dr. Emily Baxi from BD². BD² is a philanthropically driven nonprofit initiative that seeks to develop effective interventions so that all people with bipolar disorder thrive. They've joined us for an Alliance discussion a bit over a year ago when BD² just launched and was only 16 days old. So we're really looking forward to hearing all the updates and the progress you all have made. So please type your questions into the Q&A box or chat, and we will pose as many as we can during the Q&A portion of today's session. Thanks so much for joining us. Over to you, Cara.
Jacqueline, thank you so much for the intro. I did not remember that it was our 16th day when we joined last time. It is especially fun to come back and present the one-year update, as I think this might be our first time not giving an intro. So it's especially cool. I want to start by thanking Research America for hosting the discussion, for bringing the community together, specifically Ellie and Jacqueline moderating today, and more broadly to the organization for the advocacy work that you do to bring not only more funding into the research ecosystem holistically, but also advancing the policies that drive better science overall. So I'm Cara Altimus. I'm the managing director of BD², and I'm joined by my colleagues Daniel Pham and Emily Baxi today. Daniel and Emily are going to talk a lot about our actual programs that have been developed over the last year, and I'll give a bit of an overview about what we're up to at a more macro scale. So to kick off, I wanted to start with just the highest level. What is bipolar disorder? Many of us have heard about bipolar. Sometimes it's even used colloquially, but bipolar disorder is a psychiatric illness that is characterized and defined in a more medical sense by changes in mood. It's divided into two, most generally, bipolar type 1 and 2. Those with bipolar 1 have experienced at least one manic episode that lasted for longer than a week. Generally also experience depression, and those that have bipolar 2 have experienced longer major depressive episodes and generally hypomania rather than a full 1 week or longer of a manic episode. And so while we generally characterize bipolar based on changes in mood, we know that people with bipolar have many other domains of symptoms that impact and are part of the disorder. And those include changes in energy levels, changes in sleep function, and people that have bipolar over time often experience changes in cognition. Overall, though we have these two diagnoses, we actually understand that bipolar is much more heterogeneous, both in the symptoms that people experience day to day, but in the actual trajectories that the people have. And this heterogeneity is a very important part of how we need to develop treatments, design the research ecosystem, and think about creating a world that all people with bipolar are able to thrive. So if we take one step, look out about to understand how does bipolar affect the population. Daniel, can we have the next slide? We see that 3% of adults actually experience bipolar, and that number is usually much higher than people expect. In total, that's about 40 million people worldwide, probably driven somewhat by the heterogeneity, but also the research landscape over the last couple decades. Fewer than 50% of people with bipolar are able to find and stay on treatments that help manage the disorder. And like many neurological disorders and psychiatric conditions, we see a very long delay for correct diagnosis. This is especially important in bipolar because as bipolar continues, if left untreated, it's known to worsen over time. This last statistic around years of life expectancy being 10 to 20 years lower, I think is surprising for many people. And we understand that that's driven by comorbid conditions that people with bipolar often experience, such as cardiac diseases. And so as we think about bipolar as an organization and developing a research landscape, it's our hope to be taking all of these pieces, including the increased prevalence of comorbid conditions, into account as we're developing that. The last thing I want to say on this slide is that amidst all of these facts about what is bipolar and how do we understand it globally, we also have looked to understand what's happening from a funding perspective and seen that compared to other psychiatric conditions and other neurological conditions, bipolar has remained underfunded over the years. That has likely stifled innovation in the field. So when we look forward, what do we hope that BD² is able to change in the world? We are first and foremost looking to make sure that we're driving towards treatments and ways that everyone living with bipolar is able to live a healthy and full life, and that can happen wherever they are. So that first-in-class treatment happens regardless of location. And as we look at the whole ecosystem, we think BD² is able to bring community together, not just around researchers and clinicians, but also the community of people living with bipolar and other funders. So the last slide I'll give on kind of the philosophy of it all. BD² is funded by philanthropy. And so right now we've been able to move as quickly as we can because we had 3 founding funders come together. And that in doing that, we are not only pushing on a deepening understanding of bipolar and the mechanisms that are driving the disorder, but we're also bringing together researchers, clinicians, individuals with lived experience to drive our research agendas and over time to develop improved care guidelines and, importantly, carry the findings that we are able to push back into our care centers and ultimately advance clinical outcomes. And so BD² is really focused on how do we pull the right levers at the right time to take research and meaningfully move that into care. So I'll end on our vision and mission to just share that our North Star, you might say, is that all people with bipolar disorder can thrive, really looking across the whole population. And that what we're doing day to day is working to accelerate scientific discovery and advancing clinical care. And what Daniel's going to share in a moment is how we're bringing cross-disciplinary collaboration, data sharing, and real-time learning together to carry that forward. So I'm going to pass it to Daniel and look forward to questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Cara. I will move on to the next slide. Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Pham. I'm a program director at the at BD², also part of the Milken Institute. So to jump in, as Cara mentioned, although our launch was last year in 2022, the work in this field really began back in 2018. So at that time, we partnered with DBSA, the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, to survey over 6,000 people with lived experience to really understand what wellness means in people with bipolar. And this work really helped anchor what we wanted to do moving forward in lived experience, and that really continues to guide our work. And since that survey, we spent the next few years understanding the gaps and opportunities in the bipolar disorder field, talking to hundreds at this point of clinicians, researchers, people with lived experience, NIMH, other nonprofits, pharma companies, and more. And this really led us to build a very robust roadmap that became the foundation of BD². So at its core programming components, BD² is made up of 4 initiatives, and Emily will provide additional details here, but just a quick overview. The Discovery Research Grant programs are funding 4 collaborative teams to examine causal biological mechanisms ranging from mitochondria, sleep, circadian, genetics, and treatments. The genetics and omics platforms are looking at genetic and molecular components contributing to bipolar, and these basic to translational research findings are feeding into what I would consider our engine of change, which is the integrated network. And the integrated network is the combination longitudinal cohort study embedded in a learning health network that allows data from the longitudinal study to be collected in a central repository, and most importantly, given back. And really, this is part of our theory of change. The data is given back to our clinicians to help inform clinical care. It's given back to researchers to make new discoveries, and it's also given back to participants to empower themselves with their own data. And the takeaway here really is that we've intentionally built an initiative that puts collaboration front and center, using open science as a tool to help close the research and clinical gap. So we know that collaboration in science allows for rapid exchange of ideas, it builds on relevant expertise, and also sparks innovation. And so to really empower collaboration among our funded teams, we have these 2 main ways. We've built a virtual community platform called the BD² Hub, which is powered out of the Notion platform. And this is really allows all funded teams, from the lead PIs to the graduate students and the postdocs, to really connect with each other, share data, resources, and learn from one another. And through the hub, we're also setting up interest groups that bring groups across the network to share new unpublished data, discuss recent field-wide publications and interest areas. We also are setting up working groups to bring teams together to solve a certain problem that may have come up, aligning protocols across experiments that may be similar across these teams, and as well as standardizing methods. And to further incentivize collaboration, we're also implementing these collaboration grants. And these are 1-year, $150,000 grants that are available to funded teams to form new collaborations across the network, so that these collaborations are organic and not forced from the top down. So open science, of course, has been a tool that we are using to accelerate research and care. As you may know, open science can produce more rigorous science, also accelerates discovery, and can stretch research dollars. And to do this, we've set up a data coordinating center, which I think Emily will talk more about. And as mentioned, the integrated network is collecting a massive trove of data, which is aggregated and standardized by the DCC, and they will allow for rapid sharing across the network. And these data range from neuroimaging, clinical, psychometric, wellness, sleep, actigraphy, and more. Additionally, we also have a really robust open science policy, which mandates open science practices to all of our funded teams. So all the research data, code, and protocols, as well as publications, must be open access. All research data will go onto Zenodo. Protocols must be on protocol.io. Code must be in GitHub. All publications that are funded by BD² must be in open access journals. So especially with these open access journals, we are also providing the funds for folks who are publishing in these journals that are not going to be affecting their research budgets. And all of this is also written into our contracts, as well as our requests for applications, so that really ensures that the field understands these expectations from day one, even before they apply. So I'll end on this slide and pass it to Emily. So far in our first year, through 6 or 8 RFAs that we've put together, or we've given out since we launched. We've built a community of more than 24 entities or so, all of whom are very eager to and already collaborating and accelerating progress to impact the care and outcomes for bipolar disorder. So I'll pass it to Emily to talk more about the programs themselves.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. And again, thanks to Research America for giving us this opportunity to come back and present a one-year update on our progress and activities. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm Emily Baxi. I'm a program director with BD². And I think with that lovely overview from Daniel and Cara, you probably have a really good sense of the mission and vision of BD². But I'm going to drill into a little more on the details of how we're actually doing that. So collectively, in our first year, we have connected well over 100 research scientists and clinicians and invested about $60 million in supporting and advancing their work. And in terms of the integrated network, and I promise we'll dive into the details on this in just a moment, I wanted to give you first and foremost a glimpse at who these clinical sites are and their geographic distribution. So the Mayo Clinic, University of Michigan, Brigham Women's Hospital and McLean Hospital, Johns Hopkins University, UT Houston, and UCLA are all coming together in a clinical network to support the activities of the integrated network. Each site received $2.3 million to enroll and follow 600 participants over about a period of 5 years. So for now, I think I just want you to appreciate that it's a network of clinical sites working together to study bipolar disorder, but also to simultaneously learn how to improve care for people living with bipolar disorder. So if you go to the next slide, thank you, Daniel. The concept of the integrated network is really quite a novel one and emerged in direct response to the needs of the field. The need to better understand the heterogeneity and trajectory of bipolar, and the need to better predict mood changes and responses to treatment as well. And above and beyond that, it's really the need to disseminate those learnings and broadly drive advancements in care as rapidly as possible. So we developed a two-prong approach, a longitudinal study with in-depth clinical and biological profiling, and a learning health network to really accelerate the implementation of evidence-based care. And if you go to the next slide, I don't want to spend much time on this slide. This is an outline of the longitudinal cohort study design. But what I do want you to take away from it is just to know that we are really using all the tools that are currently available to us, from clinical assessments, rating, imaging, and blood work, even digital tracking, to really create these very in-depth biological and clinical profiles of the people who are coming in to participate in this research study. We go to the next slide. So quite often, LHNs, learning health networks, are referred to as socio-technical systems. This means that while they are enabled by today's technical systems, notably EHR and big data collection, at its core, a learning health network really requires a very human element to be successful. Providers and their leadership must elect to implement change as informed by the data. So let's do a quick run through just to share a few more details on how a learning health network actually works. So as mentioned, data are collected from a variety of sources, EHRs, claims data, even wearable devices. And of course, there's also input from the lived experience community. And at all points, we're striving for data that are standardized, consistent, and complete. Most importantly, we want to learn what are the key outcome measures and how do they vary under different circumstances. So essentially, what variations in care are associated with better outcomes, and these are referred to as positive deviance. And once we have a way to monitor those outcomes, we can then learn from positive deviance and start to recommend and implement change. As you might expect, this can be most challenging part of the cycle as we begin to implement change, because it requires human buy-in to really change the protocols and the process. So once an LHN has succeeded in building this core infrastructure and approach, it can be scaled to meet the needs of an increasingly large patient population. And presumably, the more patients we learn from, the more informed and robust the network becomes. So putting all that together for bipolar disorder specifically, we have a network of sites where our researchers can build in-depth clinical and biological profiles of participants over time. And in parallel, that same network is caring for those participants. Clinical practice becomes data, and that data is aggregated from across sites, analyzed, and used to generate insights into what drives better outcomes, what strategies actually improve care. Then that knowledge is put back into practice. So really, we're creating this iterative cycle of learning, change, and implementation. And with each round, our goal is to push the needle further and further towards people, not just living with bipolar disorder, but really thriving in line with our mission statement. We go to the next slide. I just wanted to touch on a little more detail, discovery research. And this is where, as Daniel mentioned, we've made a significant investment in really bringing teams of teams together. So they are working across institutes, across disciplines to really address the most pressing mechanistic questions that are at the forefront of what we know and don't know about bipolar disorder currently. So the awards specifically are up to 4.5 million across 3 years, and funded teams in addition, and to really spark their interest in more and more collaboration, can apply for an additional 150,000 to further their work. Then I think we have one more slide. So the brain omics and genetic platform, this is really to address our fundamental understanding of what are the genetic drivers that contribute and influence bipolar disorder and its outcomes. And to do this, we are working with with Mount Sinai and the Broad Institute. And you can see their funding of 5 million over 3 years and 10 million over 2 years. So in conclusion, really this has been an incredibly productive first year of activity for BD². We are continuing to encourage collaboration and open science, of course, across all of our funded investigators. Looking forward, I think on the horizon, we are on track to enroll the first participants into the integrated network early next year. And we just received letters of intent to begin a second cycle of funding for the discovery grants. So really exciting progress across all domains of BD², and we can't wait to see what year 2 will bring. And with that, I will conclude, and we'll be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. It was a really great overview about all the updates over the past year. So I'd like to ask first a few questions that came to mind as you all spoke. A few of them I'll pose to one of you, but feel free to chime in if you'd like. So first, Cara, so you provided a high-level overview of what bipolar disorder is and its prevalence. Do you see a disconnect between the attention paid to bipolar disorder and its significance as a health threat?
Absolutely. It's been a couple of years, but we did a comprehensive analysis of the funding going to bipolar disorder and other psychiatric conditions. And what we found was that funding for bipolar disorder was increasingly happening through broader mental illness efforts rather than focus specifically on bipolar. And we think that that's important funding. But we also found that when you compare that to disorders like major depressive disorder or schizophrenia, that there was much less dedicated to bipolar. And we queried that a couple different ways to make sure that we were really understanding that holistically. And the more specific we were, in fact, the more dramatic that difference was. And so what we see BD² is doing is being an integrator with many of the great efforts that are happening and that are more cross diagnostic, but bringing the necessary focus for the bipolar disorder population.
Great, thanks so much. On to the next question. Emily, this one is for you. About the cohort study participants. So given the prevalence of bipolar disorder and the challenge in accessing mental health care in rural areas, just wondering about the participants. Is there an effort to make sure rural areas are represented?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. And in designing this study, I think we really thought quite significantly about how do we reach not just the most likely folks who are gathered around specialty clinics in research academic sites, but how do we actually reach on through to people who are receiving care through primary care providers, perhaps in more rural locations. So as you'll see in our design, we have, I think, a good geographic distribution. And some of those clinics really encompass not just the specialty ones, but also local community clinics. And so those are the arms that we're going to use to really reach through and hopefully garner interest and participation from as many people as possible. But I think it's going to be a community effort, and we want to use all the channels we can. This is our starting profile of sites. We will be developing to add on additional sites. So as we see how and who we're enrolling, we will be very intentional about how do we make sure that we correct any imbalances that come up as we begin to enroll and correct for that.
I want to add to that. Emily highlighted that as we were selecting sites, we were specifically looking at how they would leverage affiliate clinics that were outside of cities. And so we do know that most of the sites have the ability to, but we also, even beyond what showed up on the map, sites like Mayo have an additional recruitment location that will be in Arizona. So giving even further geographic diversity to the sample. And then the last thing I wanted to share is, as we've worked on designing what is the integrated network protocol and how we're engaging with participants, we have moved a fair bit of the work into app-based assessments and app-based engagement, so that 364 days a year input can come remotely from wherever you are. And it's only the once annual in-person assessment. And our hope is that that does allow for greater geographic participation.
Wonderful. It's great to hear. So actually, speaking of technology, so as AI is big in the news lately, how can AI impact research in the bipolar disorder field? And I'll let anyone take the question.
I'll let Emily do that.
I love this question because there are so many ways, and I think we want to be open to them all. So, in terms of diagnosis, I think there are tools there that can help physicians in their quest to be better and faster at diagnosing. But I think we want to think of them as augmentative and not as, stand alone. So I think there are ways, as Cara mentioned, we are putting apps on participants' phones that can help create that connectivity between the participant, how they are doing from year to year. So each year, the participants will come back for a really comprehensive evaluation, what has been going well, what has not been going so well. But we want to have, obviously, frequent connection points so we can ask some of the more meaningful questions and conduct some of the measures that will inform that. I think as we do that, there are many routes to including AI that are not, yet part of what we're doing right now, but would certainly pave the way for collecting data and making that amenable to AI. So that's in the sort of interactions at the patient level. But of course, once we have aggregated that data, that's where the fun really begins, because we're bringing all these different modalities together to learn something that I think we can't learn from each individually on its own. So using AI to interrogate those data sets to generate insights will be absolutely key to how we map out the next steps, how we convert the knowledge that is gained through these studies into clinical change, relevant change at the clinical practice level.
And I can share that currently one of our funded discovery grant teams, Jenny Tam's group out of Harvard, are using machine learning to predict potential new treatments of drugs based on current treatments. So that actually is being incorporated into one of the studies right now.
Oh, wonderful. Very interesting. Thank you. So on to another topic. How do racial disparities manifest in the diagnosis, care, and treatment of individuals with the disorder? And what initiatives can be implemented to ensure good outcomes for diverse communities?
Yeah, I can start. I think, this has always been an issue. I think it's endemic to our healthcare system. And it's no different in this area, and especially with mental health. And I think for me as a Vietnamese immigrant living in America, my family doesn't talk about mental health as an issue, let alone severe mental illness such as bipolar, right? So we don't even seek out the services, let alone trying to access any treatments that oftentimes are done based on clinical trials that are severely not diverse. So the treatments may not even work for us, even if we do seek it. And I think that's a huge issue. And I think we're focusing on it kind of throughout the spectrum. I think, for example, for genetics and omics RFAs, when we released them, there was very clear intentionality of asking all the applications to send in a roster of all of their samples, and they're breaking down with sex, gender, ethnicity, race, etc., so that we have a better understanding of what exactly are the samples that are being put into the system. So it's really exciting. For example, the genetics work that we're funding through the Broad, we're funding about 30,000. We're sequencing about 30,000 samples, all of whom are of non-European ancestry. So immediately addressing some of that racial disparity in the science, and I think that's where we really have that huge impact. So all of the questions that we ask in our RFAs signal to the field, that priority, and that is really just clear cut across all of the programs that we're doing. So we're hoping that we can make a difference because we know that the disparity is just so vast.
Great, thanks. That's really good to know that you're addressing racial disparities with your initiative. So I wanted to ask also, maybe this one to you, Emily, regarding the network of the 5 inaugural sites. That you mentioned BD² is seeking out additional medical institutions throughout the US. Has there been any thought of expanding globally in the future?
It's certainly a thought. I think we're just being quite intentional about, walking before we run. So, the goal is to really demonstrate success in the model that we're creating here in the US. And practically speaking, there are some things that need to fall in place to allow us to share data in a meaningful way and really draw insight. So in the US, that means that we have a data coordinating center that's really sitting at the middle as a hub, making sure that we are able to gather data from all these different clinical practices that are, you know, putting them into different electronic health record systems, categorizing them in different ways. All of that needs to come together to be harmonized and to be accessible to our network, which will then look across the data from all of these different sites to gain insights. So we will continue to develop that out. And I think there is a definite path to bringing in data from other places and other world locations. And I think that's so important to also meet our mission of making this data and these insights relevant to as many people as possible. We're just aware of, you know, there are things like GDPR that make it a little more difficult to access that data and bring it over. Not impossible, but just maybe not a year one activity.
Great, thank you so much. So I wanted to address one question in the chat. Is it still possible for a potential participant to enroll in one of your studies? If so, who would they contact?
It is certainly possible. We are right at the stage where we actually just received our central IRB approval. Our local sites now need to receive their local IRB approval, and then we will be poised to enroll. So stay tuned, watch the website. What will happen is that as sites get activated, you will see information, who to contact, where to contact an individual who will help bring you into the study, get you connected, and if it's a good match, enrolled in this study. And we certainly welcome as many folks' participation as possible.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Trying to see if there are any more questions from the audience.
I've been trying to answer them as we go.
Yes, thank you for that.
Yeah, and just one point about the brain donation question. I think it was asked if we're encouraging participants to make arrangements to donate their brains. Yeah, I think that our Brain Omics platform is using samples from people who've passed, who have bipolar disorder. So we're able to study the disorder from the tissue in which the disorder comes from. I think it's really important to our scientific steering committee as well. So it would be a really easy and great connection to be able to get folks who may have passed, who are involved in the longitudinal study, and then use the same types of get the same type of data that was collected from the omics platform to really bridge that, because those who've been in the longitudinal cohort study have such already a deep trove of data being collected. So it is a really great opportunity. And yes, maybe we will definitely follow up with you, Tish.
Thanks, Daniel, for bringing that up. So I think that's all we have right now for audience questions, but I'll pose this to, actually, there's one in the Q&A. Not sure if you covered this, but in the first slide, but is bipolar disorder considered a spectrum disorder?
So I think maybe to answer this most clearly, bipolar is thought, I'd say, most typically as a collection of disorders rather than necessarily a spectrum disorder. And what that means is that there are many ways that people experience bipolar, and so while we bucket it in type 1 and type 2, where you see, pronounced mania in one, when you really look at the trajectory of how people experience bipolar, it's much more mixed, and is maybe not as clearly defined in those two buckets. In fact, 25% of people initially diagnosed with bipolar type 2 will go on to develop bipolar type 1. Again, just suggesting that it's probably more of an amalgamation of multiple types.
Got it. Thank you for that clarification. So I think there are no more audience questions, but I'll ask a last one to end on a positive note. Looking back at your slide, current state versus future state, can each of you kind of just elaborate on art of the possible and what you envision as best outcomes for the initiative and addressing this disorder?
I want to start and say, when we say future, a lot of what we're thinking about is not just what happens given some unknown period of time in the future, but what are we able to start affecting change in today as well? And so we're trying to bring the future not just as close to now as possible, but actually look at what we can change now, for whom and where, and for the most people. And so to merely highlight the way the integrated network has been designed and the way that we've brought clinicians to the forefront of how we're bringing science together is intended to improve outcomes and science for people today, as well as continue to push to include more and more people over time in the future. So that's one piece. And then who wants to jump in next?
I can. Yeah, I think it's really that sense of using the tools that we have today in the best possible way and making sure that, all those caring for people with bipolar disorder know what those are, but then building the tools for tomorrow. And I think that really the integrated network and the discovery grants are recognizing what a cohesive force of change that needs to actually become a reality, that it is not really navigated by any one party. It takes clinicians, physicians, people with lived experience, everyone to understand and to push the boundaries of our knowledge so we have better interventions and strategies in the future.
Wonderful. Daniel, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this has been such an exciting initiative to really think outside the box and again be greater than the sum of our parts, and how we can do this. And especially, I think, just going back on the power of philanthropy and kind of playing outside of the traditional roles of government, and how that can be then an example of how government can play a role too. So we again still are very much working with NIMH and other government entities to just make sure we all understand our roles and how we could all just accelerate change for people living with bipolar.
Great, thank you again so much. And with that, I just want to thank all of you for this discussion. And Research America is so glad to host you and also raise awareness about this cause. So I wanted to address the audience regarding our next Alliance discussion. I hope you can join us on Monday, November 20th at noon. The link to register is in the chat. This is a special Alliance discussion with epidemiologist and leading public health expert, Dr. Oscar Allen. He's the managing director of the Public Health Division at MITRE. I apologize if I didn't get that acronym correct, MITRE. This is in honor of Public Health Thank You Day. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Cara, Daniel, and Emily, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a great afternoon.